to the Simpleton Podcast. We have an interview today. It is with Nick Dolinger. He is a recent convert, and he is the creator of a podcast called The Beautiful Toilet. Nick, do you want to explain your podcast or the title of your podcast for everyone who hasn't become acquainted with it?
The title is taken from a translation of an old Chinese poem by Ezra Pound. It's originally by Mei Sheng, and of course, it's a toilet in the archaic sense. It's about the woman putting on her makeup and perfume in the morning. But I was drawn to the different layers of meaning, the kind of Orientalist tact that it kind of has, and the connection to fashion and beauty, and also to Ezra Pound, who's been one of my staples, one of my mainstays overall. And so I just thought that, I spent so long looking for a title. And when I've read that, it just kind of struck me. And I'm like, that's it. It's a no-brainer. But it really it was a month-long process to even figure out what I was going to call this project when I started it. And yeah, it's kind of just it's really important to me to consider it as a labor of love. It's like a revolving door of things that I'm interested in. And yeah.
Well, I, found you, and I thought it was important to invite you on because I found your podcast. And then in the middle of this podcast, you kind of unexpectedly reveal that you're Catholic. Uh-huh. And you start having these Catholic conversations with people who are clearly not believers. Uh-huh. Everything from club kids to hyper political gay men, and you're having these very ironic conversations that then turn really authentic really quickly. Mm-hmm. I may not understand irony well enough, so I got more questions about that later. But the reason why I brought you onto our podcast was I feel like we're the people who are in my circles are very limited, and I'm noticing that, and by limited I just mean that our view of the way Christ is working in the world is too limited. And I'm seeing people show up to our book club who I just generically call the recovering nihilists, people who are coming out of the culture, discovering Simple House, discovering the book club. And they just have a very different worldview than people who maybe became missionaries or, became associated with us in another way. And I feel like your podcast is an important part of this, kind of outside the box stuff that's going on. It's not like us complaining about Pope Francis or wondering what his next move is or, talking about classical education or just this middle-aged mentality of watching all the institutions you love fall apart right now, mm-hmm. Everything from Disney to the American. I mean, not that Disney was ever great shakes, but we mm-hmm. loved it, us mm-hmm. middle-aged people. Mm-hmm. So, and so I'm kind of curious. I want to hear about your conversion, how you got to New York City, and then I want to ask you some questions about the podcast and this kind of conversation you're having with people.
Yeah, well, thank you for all your kind words. That's exactly the vibe that I want to cultivate. So it's good to hear it vindicated and to see that you get my vision so precisely and that shines through. So thank you.
Well, where are you from originally, and how'd you end up in New York City?
So I'm from a town in Pennsylvania called York. You probably haven't heard of it, but
I've driven through it.
Oh, right. We might have talked about that actually. Yeah.
You guys have the York dumbbells.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, York barbell. Yeah.
And there's a man there's a big.
So there's there's a museum and there's a store there that's completely out of stock with basically everything ever since the weight shortage struck. But yeah, that's actually. Where I lived, right when I was born, the first 3 years of my life were basically right at that exit off of I-83. So, okay. But yeah, that's where I'm from. I live in Brooklyn now. I spent some time in Manhattan before that, about 4 years in Manhattan. As far as how I came to New York, it was really just, it was just because I went to college here and, I really like it. I took a liking to it, which is why I stayed. But the initial catalyst for moving was just going to college in New York. And I actually spent my freshman year abroad. My school had like a program where you did that before, it was like a total trial by fire. It's like before you're even settled in college, before you've ever lived anywhere but like your hometown, you're, cast into like a foreign country with like 100 odd freshmen. And so that was pretty enlightening as well and pretty formative. But yeah, after that year, I spent the rest of my time in New York City and East Village specifically. So.
And like, I feel like New York is kind of like the hotbed for culture in certain ways, and you went there and then somehow in that environment, you found Christianity.
Yeah, it's kind of a mystery to me too. Like I almost, I'm tempted to like just totally set aside my own agency and, ascribe it to like the works of grace. But I mean, it was also like a kind of dialectical process, through like just like reading certain texts. I was very influenced by Chesterton first, and then ultimately by Dante Alighieri. And I think
how did Chesterton even get into your hand?
I like how you're making like the Italian hands as soon as I say Dante Alighieri. But how did it, honestly, like I think that there were two books I was reading at the time, which were very much not Christian, that both made a passing reference to him. One of them was The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, and the other was The Sex Diary of Gerard Sorm by Colin Wilson, who's like an occultist. But they both mentioned Chesterton. I was like, maybe I should see what this is about. And when I learned about the premise of The Man Who Was Thursday, I was like pretty like drawn to it because I liked the idea that it was like this like apocalyptic like metaphysical thriller. And so that was like the first book that I read. And I actually think that that's pretty far from like a Catholic worldview because, that's a relatively early work for Chesterton as well. And he seems to have like a more like almost like a pantheistic worldview in that kind of gets refined in like later works like The Ball and the Cross. But I was like drawn to like the mystery of it, like, the way that it like speaks so lyrically about like the mysteries of life, and started reading some of the later, apologetic work after that. Like, I think, The Everlasting Man was next for me, which was like a huge influence on my own poetry as well.
Aldous Huxley was a big influence on me. Also,
really?
And then Chesterton and Lewis were influences on me, but this is now 20 years ago. And Chesterton's become way more popular in the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. Like 20 years ago, I was like bidding on an autographed Orthodoxy on eBay. Mm-hmm. And I got in a fight. The other bidder was like the guy Dale Alquist, who founded the American Chesterton Society.
Oh, yeah.
But I think, and back then in eBay, you could send each other messages.
Oh,
and
nice.
He was sniping back when sniping was first being invented. And I told him it was really rude and kind of immoral what he had tried to do by buying that book out from underneath me. And so we had this like back and forth, and it was funny. I ended up joining the American Chess Society, and I had the sense back then in the like late 90s that there were like 10 members.
Yeah.
Now it seems a lot bigger. But I'm sorry, I got off track. Have you read have you been watching this like governor kidnapping in Michigan?
I know like the broad contours of it, but I haven't been following any recent developments.
It just reminds me of The Man Who Was Thursday so perfectly.
Oh yeah, well, you know what? That's actually like a really acute observation, I think, because like what strikes me about like compare that to his first novel, Napoleon of Notting Hill, right? And
that is my all-time favorite novel. Like that is my favorite Chesterton work.
So
yes.
What I notice about that is that it's presented as like this very like whimsical, like kind of like fun romp, but like the violence is actually like really disturbing. Like it is like deeply like violent in a pretty like deranged way. Whereas like The Man Who Was Thursday, it's all presented as like this like apocalyptic, like super heavy thing. But like the violence never escalates beyond like a guy like accidentally socking a guy in the face. Like it's all like, so it's really weird, like to contemplate like the contrast between them. I guess in the case of the Man Who Is Thursday, it kind of shows like how much like, a good writer just by like setting a certain mood and tone can like create a feeling of suspense and like intensity in a situation where there's basically no violence. Like the entire thing is a ruse, more or less,
Right.
But
I kind of have mixed feelings about violence. I think it's one of these things that us modern people are too biased against.
Mm-hmm.
Like we just assume violence is bad and then work from that assumption. It's like, hold it.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you get that assumption? But like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to come off as like too edgy about it or whatever, but I think in a very real sense, like violence is necessary to like uphold the good and like the innovation of Christianity, as opposed to like pagan warrior violence, which is like something you inflict on other people. Is like the idea that like that's replaced in every situation where you can with the ability to uphold the good by sacrificing oneself and becoming like the victim.
I think that's true. I think I understood what you said pretty well. And I believe that the spiritual violence of Christianity is definitely not a physical violence, put on someone else. Mm-hmm. But I also feel weird that we're too allergic to it. Like if you just dwell in the Old Testament, or just think of us as just like also a biological being that evolved from an animal world that's incredibly violent. Mm-hmm. It's just weird that we've posited it as so evil. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some ways that's backfired on us, particularly for men, And I tend to think that King David is kind of the saint par excellence that we should be like talking about all the time, because he's the man after God's own heart. And Jesus is born of his line. And there's just, he's the guy who founds the temple. He's just, everything is so great about King David, except he has like some really obvious sins. He's also incredibly violent. So I don't know. I think my own dad, I'm sorry that we need to get back to your story, but my own dad is, if you were to say what his great virtue is, it was a certain violence. It was a certain like willingness to be radical and who's a big rugby player and football player and things like this. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I think there's something missing in our understanding right now, and I haven't been able to put my finger on it, so I can't. I just don't want to. Yeah, there you go. Well, tell me. All right, so tell me about so Chesterton fell in your lap. Were you like stumbling into a church at this time, or?
Yeah. I like dabbled. Like I would go to like some Sundays to like an Episcopalian church in the neighborhood. But I wasn't really like committed to a religion. I didn't have a community, and so I ultimately I just kind of like fell out of the habit. But I was still like interested in Christianity. And yeah, at one point I was reading the Divine Comedy. And I didn't realize until much later how influential it was on me, just like seeing everything laid out and seeing like how systemic and like comprehensive Catholic thought could be, and how it touches on everything and creates like such a genuine like cohesive worldview. And I think that being exposed to the Divine Comedy at the time that I was pretty influential. And then from there, I guess it was like a matter of months before Catholicism just really came onto my radar more, and I started saying it was a question of when, not if, I would become Catholic. And that when turned out to be like sooner than I would have expected, I guess. But because once you're in that frame of mind, you just kind of like, you're excited to like move on to that.
What did you ever show up to your university's like Newman group or a campus ministry, and what was your reaction?
Only when I was already in RCIA, and at that point, like that was like my senior year, and I had like pretty limited like interactions with them. They were very friendly. I would go to confession sometimes because I didn't know you weren't supposed to do that when you were in RCIA. But I was already baptized, so it was like it technically like sacramental. But in any event, like I would go to confessions at the NYU Catholic Center, which I thought was really helpful, like really convenient, and I really liked the priest that was there. But yeah, I had like pretty, limited experiences with the Catholic life at NYU. I kind of just, by virtue of like friends that I had, I got involved with like a non-denominational thing called InterVarsity. And it basically, like, I had this idea that I wanted to launch a fellowship group called the Muscular Christians of NYU and try to like revive like the tradition of muscular Christianity. And it kind of like fell through, but I ended up in InterVarsity for a season or two, just because that was I had a friend who was involved, and they were looking for someone to start like a men's fellowship group, and so I kind of like fit the niche in a weird way. It was just like a kind of like a fortuitous, but yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like a lot of people have felt there's something missing out of masculinity right now. And then I've never liked any of the projects they started, though.
Yeah.
You know, like it's always felt like a little bit like LARPing or fake in some way.
Yeah, I found some like Bible verses that I thought were like relevant to like masculinity, and then we did a Bible study, and it was like I think there were like 5 of us, and like I invited my like very red-pilled friend, and he was just like, oh, I think that what was it? He was talking about how one or another like Greek hero was just like like abandoned his wife and how base that was. But I thought it was like I don't know. I thought it was like a useful like clarifying conversation just to like see the difference. But
well, what do you mean by based? Like, what's it mean to say leaving your wife is based?
I think that he was saying something to the effect that like that being like independent from a woman and like not allowing her concerns to dominate you. I don't know. I'm trying to be like charitable, but
well, even that doesn't sound like a great philosophy.
I know, and that's what I said, and I'm like, well, look, you look at like this like myth. It's like, well, not only did it like did he betray his promise, but like he also like brought ruin on his family. I feel, is it Perseus or something? I need to brush up on my mythology so I know the reference that was made. But it was like it was a pretty. I mean, I just thought it was like a good Bible study because it was probably like the most like contentious that I'd been to, and
right.
Like, and everyone was kind of like, dude, what? Like, but that was.
I find that to be good Bible studies too. Like we had a guy at our book club kind of make the suggestion that there would be pain in heaven. Uh-huh. And it like just sparked a good conversation because he like had some reasons why he thought that would be the case. And or maybe I'm putting a few words in his mouth, but it was just like, thankfully someone's saying something outside the box here, so we don't have to just be, politely all agree with each other the whole time.
Yeah, because my thing was meant to be like ecumenical, and like most of my friends were not Christian, but I took everyone who would come, and it was just at my apartment at the time, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, but it just like. Getting people to show up was kind of, to the muscular Christians of NYU was kind of like pulling teeth. So
I could imagine.
Yeah.
So what is the idea of your podcast in the sense of like, what is the conversation that you're trying to enter into, or who with, or what is the like space you're trying to inhabit with it? Like, what are you trying to like tackle or work out through this podcast?
I mean, I guess like I just really want to like talk about like things that I like, and it's like based on my hope that it will be like powerful and like moving and like good for the world in a small way to like just like celebrate things that I like, and talk about like culture and spirituality in a way that's like open and isn't like totally beholden to kind of like politically correct dogma. And so, I mean, and, I also thought it would be cool to like talk to people, like, have like something to like invite people whose work I was interested in to talk about it, and like have, a way to like, ask questions to people that I thought were interesting, but, but not just in the context of like, oh, I was wondering this, but like we can actually create something. And, that's my pitch. And yeah, I think it's been really edifying so far, to create it at least. It's been my primary creative outlet for the past almost a year since I started it. So
I have this sense that I want to talk about how you guys use irony, or how you guys like kind of use transgressiveness in the podcast. And I get this sense that this is like a younger generation thing that I'm trying to catch up with, right? Mm-hmm. And if I was to, like, I'm going to give you my theory and then you kind of poke holes in it or what. But like, I get the sense that a lot of people have tried to have honest conversations about the faith, about politics, about whatever. And then they find that the other side's actually not being honest. You know, like it's actually, I'm trying to, in good faith, try to explain to you my part, and you're trying to win something, or you're trying to undermine it, or you're just looking for something to impeach me with in what I say. And therefore, like a real political conversation is not happening, a real religious conversation is not happening. I think this is the problem with apologetics usually, is that you can learn all the apologetics you want, show up to a bar or wherever and find a person to argue with, and you're not actually bringing anyone to Christ.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, like, I really do believe, like, if your interlocutor is, like, being, like, really hostile and, like, not entertaining you in good faith, they're still being, like, authentic to their feelings most of the time. But yeah.
Well, I mean, like if it was a political conversation, if one person values the Constitution and the other person thinks the Constitution is a corrupt document written by a bunch of slaveholders, then one person trying to make points from the Constitution, the other person will make points to the extent it serves their purpose, but they really don't care at the end of the day.
Yeah.
What the Constitution says, right?
Right, because like they have like a kind of like overarching framework that means that like the constitutional appeal isn't really relevant, right?
Right. So they use it when it's useful. They use it to score a point, but they don't actually use it the same way the other side's using it. You know? And there's a dishonesty there. Like there's like a way in which one side's playing by a certain set of rules and the other side is allowed to cheat, you know? And I feel like the way you guys sometimes, like what really struck me about your podcast is you guys will have these like ironic conversations that switch to authenticity so quickly. And I wonder if part of the irony is to turn away the disingenuous conversation. Like, are you willing to joke around with me like this, or are you too easily offended? And if you're too easily offended, you won't be here by the time we get authentic.
Yeah, that's true. You could like frame it as like a way of seeing if you're like on the level, or, you know, you're like on the same wavelength. I think that, I mean, for Zoomers especially, you know, like irony is kind of like the water that you're swimming in, right? Like the parable about the fish who, you know, one of them's like, how's the water today? And he's like, well, what's water? Like, like that's kind of like what irony is to, I think, my generation.
So what is irony poisoning in that context?
I guess that's like when you like lose yourself, right? Like you lose like your agency and like your sense of values, and like you're unable to like grasp onto anything that isn't like, and that feels sincere and like isn't like a bit, you know?
Yeah, maybe you lose your ability to be authentic because you've been ironic so long.
Right. But like, I don't know, like for me, like, I don't think there's any inherent like tension there, or like there's no inherent like contradiction in that. Like, I don't know, like, I just think that a lot of like the things that I love the most sincerely, like, are also things that have like a twinge of the ironic. I mean, I think that Chesterton understood like the appeal of the ironic too, because like he, you know, he's famous for like paradox, right? And like that's kind of like one of his like tropes, and like just like understanding like how bizarre and anomalous and funny it is, like the phenomenology of human experience, you know, and how that can like connect you to like the divine, because it is like so mysterious and difficult to, you know, describe in purely like sincere terms, like the emotional experience of being a person.
There is a political aspect to your podcast.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, I couldn't deny that. Yeah.
And how does Catholicism define this kind of left-right thing that you're discussing in your podcast? Or how does that inform it, or what?
I mean, I think that like just like Christianity in general kind of has aspects of both, in that the way that I constitute that divide in my mind is like the same way that Curtis Yarvin would, where it's like kind of like entropy versus like order, right? Or like pronomianism. And like insofar as like meaningful like human structures have been built, and like what's the word? Like, you know, institutions that create like rules and strictures and like systems of meaning, like those institutions, like they're, as soon as it's been established, it's being corroded by like just like the force of history and by the kind of like whatever power can be gained by subverting it. And so like I think the fundamental difference between like progressive or like left-wing worldviews versus like right-wing worldviews is the difference between like eschatology versus eternal struggle. Like, you know, you hear that as like one of the like characteristics of like fascism, for example, is like the idea that the struggle is eternal and there's going to be warfare forever. But I think that that's more like broadly like correctly identifies something about like a right-wing worldview, whereas like, you know, progressive worldviews, whether they be like centrist, like Francis Fukuyama, or like Marxian in nature, like they kind of like tend to be defined by the notion that if we expend like cultural like thermodynamic energy now, we can advance to a state of being that has resolved conflict and that is like more desirable. And I mean, you know, Christianity is like eschatological in its like final like vision of the world. But in a worldly sense, I think that it's historically been grounded in the temporal reality of like eternal struggle, notwithstanding like, you know, Gnosticism and other kind of like offshoots of like the Christian tradition. But so yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's, you know, I think about it in terms of like metaphysics and like kind of
well, I think I like the definition of liberal and conservative, meaning the way I would almost surmise it is like there's a belief in progress or an eschatology almost to a utopia in one sense. Mm-hmm. And then there's this other thing that we're always like holding back the barbarism, mm-hmm. and we're creating structures to like civilize ourselves in that way. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have to continually renew those structures, defend those structures, work on those structures if we're going to have any progress. But there's always like there's part of the thing that struck me is there's been this attitude of like, burn it all down and then something better will take its place. But don't ask me what the better thing is.
Yeah,
you know, and it's like, that's a huge act of faith. Like,
yeah. Well, I think there's some kind of like a metaphor for this that comes in. I think it's in The Everlasting Man, where Chesterton says something to the effect of like, well, let's say that you have like a white fence and you want to be conservative about it, right? Like, it's like, well, you think like people kind of have this instinct that like conservatism is status quo, so not doing anything is conservative. But he's saying that like to be conservative about it is actually the more proactive process, right? Because that means like it's going to be subjected to weathering. You're going to have to constantly like repaint it, like whitewash it, like you know, replace the faulty parts, and it's you're fighting a fundamentally losing battle against like the elements, but you know, you do it because it's meaningful and you want to preserve something, you know, it maybe just like a generation longer. Whereas to be progressive about that fence, like you just have to sit there and let the elements take their toll.
Right. Or
I mean, you can accelerate the process by like kicking it and like, you know, pouring acid on the fence, but like that's really unnecessary, you know, because at the end of the day, like it's going to fall apart by its own devices. Like, you know, in our like fallen state, like everything that we build that's good, like is going to be like corrupted by, you know, human sinfulness.
So to kind of take it away from the liberal conservative dichotomy and to think about like how I feel like the Christian attitude should be, I feel like we're always not maintaining fences, we're literally building, and mm-hmm. maybe a fence is a bad word for it, but like trying to bring into being the society that we want, in the community that we want, in the parish that we want, mm-hmm. always.
Yeah.
And like when I started Simple House, there was another ministry that was a really like courageous ministry, but it was falling apart. Mm-hmm. It'd been around like 20, 30 years, and it was like kind of in its last couple years of life. Mm-hmm. And there was a sense in which it was like, how can we let this fall apart? Because there's nobody else doing what this group's doing. Mm-hmm. Right. And in a way, the thing that got me fired up was to say, it's okay that things die as long as we keep founding new ones. Mm-hmm. You know, as long as we keep giving birth to new organizations that are really out there and like courageously Christian, it's okay when they die, you know, mm-hmm. like more religious orders don't exist today or have ceased to exist than do exist.
Right. Yeah, I think that might be a weakness of the metaphor. But like, it's just, you know, the point that you should always be building, like always constructing something, I think is like a recognition of that. There's never going to be like a cessation, and like things, like old institutions are going to like fall apart and become obsolete. And and, but that's why it's always like a proactive process. And that's why, in our worldly lives, like there will really like be no peace. It's always just going to be like, if you like, I guess like the ideal of like becoming a saint is like ascending to like a higher level of struggle where like the moral struggles that you might have had, like, in your younger years, like, seem like petty in comparison, and you're realizing like that there's always like a newer frontier of like temptation and virtue, and that you're always called to like do the most that you can.
Yeah. And I think the temptation against this is kind of what I see is where it's like every new like little battle lost or bad thing that happens, you go, oh, now we're doomed. It's like we're in the Titanic and it's like there's even another hole in the, ship, and now we're really going to sink. But really you're waiting for the next hole. So you can say, now we're really doomed, But you're never like building the next ship. You're never like, actually doing anything constructive with this information. It's just enjoying the outrage of it,
Yeah.
But, well, what is, I'm interested in anything else you want to add. I also want to get an episode suggestion from you for your podcast. I have one I want to suggest. It might be the same one you'd suggest.
Well, my most recent one, By the Lantern with Dave Green, I think was definitely one of my favorites. I think that we cover a lot of the content that we've talked about here. And it's like a little bit more, probably like a little bit more comprehensive in terms of my thought about like a lot of those ideas.
I thought that podcast was excellent.
Thank you.
And it really broadened my mind. And I kind of fell in love with Dave Green during that podcast, which for people who don't know, he's got a YouTube channel called The Distributivist.
Yeah.
Also a Chesterton reference, basically. And I then started listening to Dave on other interviews because I'd heard you interview him. And I was like, oh, this isn't as good as when Nick interviewed him.
Oh, really? Well,
yeah.
I don't know about that. I loved, I think that he's all of his appearances are great. I think that my favorite is still probably like Ephemeral Angels with Curtis Yarvin. That was like a big turning point for me personally, I think.
I need to go listen to that. What's interesting also, though, is that these guys who are coming to our book club, who I admire, who are kind of coming out of the culture, they told me that they listened to the Red Scare podcast. They listened to Contain, and then I talked to you and you're like you mentioned Red Scare in your podcast, and you also mentioned Contain, and you told me the best podcast episode of all time is this certain Contain episode. So I listened to what you called the best podcast episode of all time, and I thought it wasn't even as good as the worst episode I've heard of your podcast.
Oh, really? Well, thank you.
And I'm not doing that to give you a great compliment. I just thought it was a bad episode.
Oh, I don't know.
Apparently, we just have different taste.
I like, one thing I do really admire is when there's kind of like this very spontaneous like energy to a podcast.
It was that.
And I don't really think that mine is really that spontaneous most of the time. I feel like it's like more like relaxed and like kind of like, like sleepy.
That's right. Yeah. The
like
podcast you recommended had someone waking up in the middle of it and joining in and being like, sorry, I'm late. And you're like, what's going on here?
Yeah, because I feel like I've been a part of that. Like I recently appeared on my friend Charlie Looker's live stream, and like I feel like I accidentally did that because I was having technical issues the whole time, and just like the topics were like changing. And I like it's thrilling. Like there's a certain like jouissance to like that kind of recording. But
I think if I knew them as people, I would have found it more entertaining than I did. So maybe that's what the key is. But anyway, well, thank you, Nick. Is there anything else you want to add before we go?
No, nothing really comes to mind, but thank you so much for having me on. This, I hope this is, pleasing to you, and that your audience will gain something from it. And,
well, I'm hoping that, I'm hoping they do too. And I'm also hoping that I feel like if you keep following Christ and keep bringing up God and authentic religious experience in your podcast, I just find it fascinating because you're showing how to talk to people, people who are not of our religion, people who are against our religion, and you're just having very nice conversations with them. And it's beautiful.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I feel like, I'm kind of really like too inexperienced and like too new to the faith to be like a full blown like missionary or like evangelist in like a proper sense. So I'm kind of just like approaching it from this position of like talking about things that I'm interested in. But I guess like in terms of my personal practice, like more generally, I just think that it's really important to always be open and kind of like maintain like dexterity and be like nimble in engaging with ideas. And I guess like the liability of that, if someone could probably criticize me for becoming like almost like an empty vessel that can be like corrupted by the world, right? Because like the more you engage with it on its own terms, like then the more like the less like distinct you are on your own terms to some extent. But it's always going to be a balance.
I just don't buy that empty vessel idea at all. I feel like we as Catholics have two very classical tried ways that we approach things. We approach things through kind of like an indoctrination or through an apologetic. And it's like both of them kind of suck. Both of them aren't about having heart-to-heart conversations with another human. And I think ultimately the whole world is shot through with Christ. And yes, there's fallen, and yes, but every time you're encountering anyone on your podcast, it's clearly the image and likeness of God. And you're like speaking to them like that.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, everyone are like people that I like, that's why I have them on.
And I think you're fortified enough that you're not like catching their mind virus, if that's what's happening, but you're giving them a mind virus.
I hope so. That's the idea. I mean, like I am like, firm in my beliefs. Like I have like a pretty good grasp of like where I stand or whatever. So, I feel like I can generally like afford to like be like kind of like open and inquisitive and like try to engage with things on like a different level, but yeah, that's like really like I guess like where I assign priority in a lot of ways is like to being just like approaching things and like never kind of becoming like locked in like one pattern of thinking and like trying to be as like I said like as dexterous as possible.
Well, that's great. I mean, I'm rooting for you. So.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. And thanks for listening too. I really, I'm always like surprised, like encountering like people in the world that I've never talked to before who are like talk to me about the podcast and like reach out and like invite me to cool shows like this. And
cool. All right. Well, God bless, and talk to you in a minute.
Likewise.